It's 4:03 p.m. in far north Queensland, and also other places on the eastern coast. And I can see that there are people joining us from within this continent, but also other places around the world. So thank you for joining us. Um, this is I was going to do a count. This is maybe the sixth um, online seminar that the Roderick Centre for Australian Literature and Creative Writing has hosted since starting about 18 to 24 months ago. And so Dr. Dashiell is continuing the tradition that's so far had a number of scholars from across Australia who've been speaking. I'm Associate Professor Roger Osborne. I'm a member of the Roderick Centre for Australian Literature and Creative Writing here so I'm in Cairns, the Nomabata campus. So I'd like to acknowledge the Irriganji people on whose land I live and work. You might like to acknowledge the peoples of the land on which you are, if you're on Zoom. And I can see Brenda Machowski who's on the island of Hawaii, is still on yesterday time. So it is quite a gathering that we have here this afternoon. So for those, just to give you a basic introduction to the Roderick Centre for Australian Literature and Creative Writing. We exist because of the generous donations of both Colin and Margaret Roderick. Colin Roderick was the foundation professor of English literature here at James Cook University, and he was here for quite a number of years, establishing the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies, which has an annual award. It's now called the Margaret and Colin Roderick Award for the best book in Australian writing. So there is a sense that there is a recognition of all sorts of writing that is recognised within the Roderick Centre for Australian Literature and Creative Writing. Colin Roderick was an editor at Angus and Robertson for many years, and also a scholar who was appointed Professor of English at JCU in 1965. He's worked on many of Australian writers such as Miles Franklin and Henry Lawson, and has left a significant legacy for us to follow here at James Cook University. And so it's with great pleasure that we're able to invite people such as Dr. Dashiell Moore to far north Queensland and to find themselves away from a cooler climate at this time of year. I've come to understand that it's quite an attractive place to be for those who come from Melbourne and Sydney. Also a test at times when the humidity gets to a certain level. Most of you who are joining us here this afternoon will know Dash Moore and his work, but I'm going to do the formal introduction. When we invited Dash, he was not an ARC DECRA Fellow, and so that's something that has come to pass since the invitation for Dash to come up here. And he was also not the recipient of the Walter McRae Russell Award for work in Australian literature either. And so it was quite satisfying that we invited Dash here before those recognitions came to him. But it is a testament to the quality of the work that he does and the impact that his work has been having on the field of Australian literature. So he is an ARC DECRA Fellow in English at the University of Sydney. His research is in the fields of world literature, island studies, and post-colonial theory, with a particular geographical concentration in Australia, the Caribbean, and Oceania. A key focus of his work is on intercolonial intersections in literary production, which was the subject of his recent monograph, the prize-winning Literary Mirroring of Aboriginal Australia and the Caribbean. And as we know, he is here as a DECRA Fellow, but a visiting Fellow at the Roderick Centre for Australian Literature and Creative Writing. His current research is on the literary representations of carcerality and archipelagos. The Thank you, Dash, for coming to, well, I can say far north Queensland because he is just down the hallway from me right now. He's been in Townsville and also in Cairns. And it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Dashiell Moore to speak to us this afternoon, the Blackbirding Archipelago in Australian and Pacific Literatures. Thanks, Dash.
Thank you, Roger. What a great introduction. I'm so humbled by that and honored to be speaking with you all today and to see so many familiar faces, some of whom I've come to know in coming up here as a Roderick visiting fellow, and others who I've known for a long time. This paper lecture was written on the lands of the Bindal in Irragadjin language groups on James Cook University's Townsville, Pibigu, Yamba campus and the Cairns Namabada campus. And I'd like to just begin by in expressing my thanks as a visitor to this place for the continuity of custodianship and knowledge of elders past and present, as well as I'm grateful for Indigenous peoples who are with us today. I'm also very grateful for the support of the Roderick Centre and the Australian Research Council as a DECRA scholar. This paper represents early thinking in a research project examining literary representations of what I'm loosely calling an archipelago of confinement, passing literary histories of medical quarantine, plantation labour, the reserve management system, and offshore detention. As part of that project, this paper analyzes a literary history of blackbirding, the systematic trafficking of more than 62,000 Pacific Islanders from across the Pacific, but I'll be speaking today most notably in relation to the Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands. Peoples were kind of brought into Australian eastern coastline from 1847 to at least from and in beyond deportation, commonly working in sugar and pastoral industries. While the trade is of a global character and extends across Australia, my focus will be on materials I've been lucky enough to engage with through JCU special collections. I'll also refer to interviews with Australian South Sea Islanders in Sydney and Mackay. And I want to make clear from the outset that these interviews are A, not representative, but they're also B, not determined by a single source of knowledge. And these interviewees are knowledge holders, activists, community leaders. These are own language, their own resources, and have performed enormous labor in keeping their own cultural records and historical records. Testimonies are not given lightly, and in many ways, this talk is answerable to those conversations. So, as I begin, and for those keeping score at home, I've structured this talk in a few time periods actually. 1868 and 1872, the post-abolitionist legacies in which I'll discuss the post-abolitionist legacies of blackbirding in a discourse of regulation. 1895 to 1906, in which Louis Beck looks back to the halcyon days before regulation in a period of the deportation of South Sea Islanders and with the onset of the White Australia policy. 1948 to 1949, in which we see Jean Giovanni's post-war history of sugar and deportation. 1970 to 1980, in which we hear from Faith Bandler, among a number of South Sea Islanders who use novels and oral histories to create what I'm calling kind of an archipelagic memory around the trade. So, to begin, we need to identify the meaning of an archipelago as a series of disconnected islands before turning to the significance of this trope in the language often used to describe blackbirding, or as Kabir and Raimondi ask, following Stratford et al., how, where, and why is the archipelagic remembered, and what leads to its being forgotten? Islands, oh, pardon me, there we go, that's fine. Islands, Johan Riqui posits, often exceed their representation, challenging ideologies of control as often as they consolidate them. Robinsonade fantasies evolved with an evolving political and legal discourse in imperial jurisdictions and boundaries, so that, as Elizabeth McMahon posits, the island in the turn of the of empire is synonymous with a kind of natural sovereignty. An archipelago arguably denotes a more unstable alignment of ecology and political geography. Markman Ellis, in his contribution to Islands in History and Representation, tracks this instability in georgic representations of Britain's imperial archipelago in the 17th and 18th centuries, a poem of which he refers to on screen here. Poets Henry James Pye and James Granger, for instance, and quoting Ellis, conceive empire as a coming together of islands. These poets visualize a joined region, quoting Pai's Necrotia or naval dominion, that disappeared from view, or at least had a less kind of immediate public resonance in following abolitionist debates. As quoting Ellis again, it became clear that the bonds of empire protected only the liberty of the British planters and not the enslaved Africans they kidnapped. This political and metaphorical distinction, Ellis argues, helped consolidate the dominant understanding of the island as insular, so that to imagine the archipelago after abolition is to track a series of distinct territories, different legal jurisdictions, memoryscapes, and cultural contours. We've come to know since, through the works of Pacific and Caribbean writers such as Albert Wentz, Epeli Afor, Edouard Glissant, and Kamal Brathwaite, the connections of disconnected isles of empire, how Afoa's distinction of a sea of islands from islands in a far sea critiques the arrangement of insular islands in relation to a distant center, and Glissant articulates the concept of archipelagic thought to understand the archipelago as a prism of multiplicity and interconnection, in opposition to continental and systemic thought. Drawing on Glissant and a number of other writers of world literature, Wani novelist Alexis Wright attributes her novel Carpentaria to a collectivity of these disconnected islands in an essay on writing Carpentaria, which imagined from an Australian heritage that has created disconnected islands of individuals, families, races, regions, beliefs, just as the continent itself is an island disconnected from anywhere else. Writing soon after, Suvendrini Pereira interrogates Australia's attempted containment of its archipelagic surroundings, noting that within discourses of border protection and colonialism, these relegated and alienated geographies fail to remain in their allocated places, returning to encroach on the territoriality of the island continent and continually to threaten the violation of its perfect and enclosed geobody. Taking these arguments in hand, I want to point out here that the archipelago is not solely a geometaphorical figure that escapes its containment in representation, but also an unstable discourse of power, frequently used to connect and conceal the connections of islands of confinement that are produced in sequence as similar and yet different. In literary language, this often takes shape in a metonymic leap between the island and this wider archipelago or a wider whole, an operation that emerges precisely from the instability of the insular island as it was posited, or as it was kind of made dominant after abolition. To consider these repeated isolations, we might turn to Laura Ann Stoller's concept of colonial aphasia, to know and not know simultaneously what cannot be thought and what cannot be said. These dynamics also resonate with responses to Alexander Solzhenitsyn's concept of the carceral archipelago in Australian scholarship. Here I'm thinking of the Aboriginal archipelago, first theorized by Charles Rowley, but returned to in Bob Hodge and Vijay Mishra, and recently developed further by Darug poet, scholar, and editor Evelyn Araluen, who theorizes the Aboriginal archipelago to consider at once the physical elimination of Aboriginal peoples, a removal from a shared social space, so kind of in effect playing on the deserted island trope, and the conjuring of the same peoples as omnipresent in spectral forms, in essence as archipelago, ultimately allowing for the clearing of space for settlement. Pacifica scholar Tracy Banavanua identifies a similar logic in the framing of Australia's national identity against the transportation, containment and deportation of South Sea Islander bodies from and to the islands. Australia's national identity then being, quote, dependent on the absence to vacate the land, as well as the presence to work the land of blackness, which needed in turn to be both protected and restricted and above all contained. Banavanua extends Ellis's argument here by emphasizing the simultaneous isolation and extension of South Sea Islanders in a post-abolitionist language of concealed continuity and repeated insularity, dynamics that influence the language that is used to define enslavement in Australia. This is not solely the topic of this project, but I want to kind of point out that in an interview for this project, an anonymous Garang South Sea Islander woman regards blackbirding as, quote, a form of bondage tethered to a contract, which was tantamount to slavery in a more polite form. The phrase tantamount here brings attention to contested terms. The majority of scholarship defines blackbirding as a specific example of indentured labor that varied widely in practice. advocating for better recognition of the degree of agency of South Sea Islanders as recruits, labourers, and sailors. Clive Moore, for instance, suggests that 5 to 10% of islanders were illegally recruited, while all, as Moore suggests, were culturally kidnapped, taken advantage of in languages and circumstances that were not fully understood. As I kind of come to this point, I want to point out that we haven't escaped the pitfalls of archipelagic logic here. Even in this example, blackbirding is defined between an isolated occurrence of 5 to 10% and a universal 100%. A metonymic leap between isolated and therefore relatively uncommon and widespread or overwhelming or undeniable practices. A trope that repeats in the factual and fictive languages that are used to describe the trade in Australian writing. Banavanua Ma, to return to that to her violence and colonial dialogue, recognizes the continuity of colonialist epistemes in these discourses of definition, which he terms Melanesianism, taking particular issue with debates of voluntary engagement, given that a system of trafficking, quote, could not be accurately described as voluntary. And this point is similar to Imelda Davis's position articulated in a recent master's thesis, Children of the Sugar Slaves, and in her extensive work as president of the Australian South Sea Islanders Association for Port Jackson. Blackbirding was, as Quito Swan writes in the Black Pacifica, transnational, elements that complicate this framing. The capital that helped establish the trade was inextricable from expansion, convictism, and enslavement, or in Emma Christopher's words, an illegitimate offspring of slavery, fed by, among other things, payments reimbursing slavers after the legislation of abolition. A history Jane Lyden has told in partnership with the Legacies of British Slavery project. The Australian pioneer of the sugar industry in Tascott, Thomas Scott, directly assisted with the sale and management of enslaved Africans in Antigua, but, as was pointed out at the time, was only able to produce sugar through the knowledge of Antiguan James William, an ex-slave transported as a convict to Sydney in 1820. The blackbirding trade itself took shape within these kinds of routes, for instance, between the renewal of convict labour and the import of coolie, quote-unquote coolie labourers in the 1830s by, founding figures such as Wentworth, Mackay, and Boyd. And here I want to kind of point to Boyd to open up the first kind of poetic retelling of the trade. Benjamin Boyd arguably kind of begins the trade in his first expedition in 1847. And he was the son of a wealthy London slave trader, Edward Boyd, the owner of the Croydon, which is now kind of renowned as making one of the last slaving voyages to Jamaica in 1807. As Marion Diamond wrote in Boyd's 1988 biography, Boyd had grown up himself with an African servant named Dick. And Boyd, in Sydney at least, attempted to disavow his own past, reinventing himself as a self-made man in a language of speculation. This fiction was seized upon by poet Francis Webb in A Drum for Ben Boyd, who, mimicking Hamlet's address to poor Yorick, poeticizes the recovery of what was believed to be Boyd's skull from the Solomon Islands. Quote, "Dead men have the power to mock us even while we juggle their actual bones. They have slipped clean out of illusion and they grow. 6 feet when he died, this fellow would top a cloud. The thing's too full of ghosts. I hate the feel of it. Holding it is like splintering a mirror and finding 1,000 faces round your boots." The collapse of Boyd's splintered mirror into 1,000 faces of speculation and capital aptly recalls the transference of the slave trade into Australia. Returning here to historiography, the commercial production of sugar was first milled in 1862 using the expertise of John Buhot, a prior manager of Barbados sugar plantations. In 1868, recognizing the impact of the American Civil War on the cotton industry, Robert Towns, the founder of Townsville, chartered the Don Juan to the New Hebrides or Vanuatu to coerce islanders onto his cotton fields by the Logan River. He would famously work with notorious blackbirder Ross Lewin on these and other voyages. Records survive in the regulation of Lewin's work. The Royal Navy's commander George Palmer describes, I'm quoting from the quote on screen here, Lewin's vessels as fitted up precisely like an African slaver, minus the irons, and noted that I have heard of him, Lewin, at every island I was at as a man stealer and kidnapper. Webb's poetry of splintered vision suggests the reinvention of capital and language in the Pacific labor trade. The term itself, blackbirding, arose in the transatlantic vernacular. Among the earliest references to the term, novelist Henry Milton describes sailors in his novel Rivalry, describes sailors speaking of going to the coast of Africa to catch blackbirds without wings. I'd like to add to this a note in interview made by third generation South Sea Islander Christine Andrew, who also traces the origin of the term blackbirding. Quote, I found all these books, almost 40 of them, 30, and they're the British Empire magazines, the British Empire, and they come out every month. And I picked them all. I bought the lot. I went in and one talking about slavery, one magazine on slavery, and in it said, you know how they called them blackbirders? Because when the slaves ran away in the bush, this blackbird used to fly out under the bushes. When the plantation seen that, they knew there was some disturbance there. Andrew's recovery of the term blackbirding from the magazines of empire highlights the imaginative overlap of the Caribbean, West Africa, and the North Queensland labour trades. Also here configured against the migration of birds. Of Mackay, perhaps we might consider the spangled drongo migrating from New Guinea, the crow or the raven, and here I'm grateful to conversations with Janet Ambrose on this point. Andrew's comments usefully turn attention to the continuity of language between trades. Blackbirding is often regarded in newspapers as slavery in disguise, as clandestine slave trade, and in public statements on the trade. I mean, here I'm turning to 1871 as the Bishop of Melbourne, addressing his congregation after the infamous murder of Bishop Patterson, the Solomon Islands, states, I cannot call this a slave trade, although it partakes very much of the character of a slave trade. These statements reflect again a language tested by an archipelago of insular islands, the limits of public outrage, discrepant legal languages, jurisdictions, and histories. The British Foreign Office papers on the Pacific slave trade collected after the passing of the 1868 Polynesian Labourers Act routinely acknowledged the impossibility of regulating the trade. Among other reasons, exemptions from prosecution could be granted in sovereign territories, such as Fiji. So, for instance, in 1872, the British consul to Fiji, Edward March, reports that the owner of the blackbirding ship, the Nukalau, averred, quote, that he was no longer a British subject, having taken the oath of allegiance to Fiji, and he considered the Nukalau a Fijian vessel, despite, at this time, returning from, quote, one of the most successful labour trips on record, bringing no less than 108 Solomon Island natives to Fiji. Summarizing this discourse in a report filed to the British Foreign Office in 1871, Captain Thomas Capel Tilley of the Southern Cross states, it is certain that horrible atrocities are sometimes committed. Again, we have this archipelagic language sweeping the trade. A single atrocity colors a widespread practice in the certainty of its existence, but the impossibility of atrocity in the whole minimizes those committed. The instability of insular borders transposed onto the islands reflects a language of colonial reinvention, of privatized industry, limited jurisdiction, and an evolving idea of the law, still defined by the spectre of the Americas, all of which combined to create the conditions for mass murder, the cultural kidnapping of more than 62,000 people, and the depopulation of entire islands across the Pacific. And yet we must understand these dynamics, these disappearances in intersecting agencies and a human scale. There's a common story, and here I'm kind of drawing on an interview with Imelda Davis, who's with us today, of men and women being asked to kind of go down to the beach to gather fish, water, or food, but not returning. I've provided on screen here an example told by Doug Mooney, who retells the arrival of his great-grandparents, Rawara and Silatase, later known as Elizabeth and Charlie Silitas, from the island of Mewo in Vanuatu. I'll read this out. She walked backwards in the sand. See the custom over there. She had to marry this old guy. And old Charlie Silitas had been blackbirded first. And he went back after his time was up and told her about, hey, there's this place called Queensland. And he said, if they want me to go back, I'll go back. And sure enough, the recruitment ship came into the bay and they knew of him. And they said, oh yeah, I'll go back. And they came to pick up some more recruits. But this time it was indentured labor then, wasn't blackbirding. They said, you got to marry this other bloke. You can't go on the ship. So she walked backwards in the sand down to the boat. And he waited there in a little dinghy and took her. And the people thought, oh, there's footmarks coming back to the village. But when morning came, she's gone. They're halfway out to the Coral Sea. And so they said, well, we'll fix her. Next ship comes, we're going to send a bloke out and kill her. But the ship by chance went to Bundaberg. It didn't come to Mackay. And when old Rudy Sabo was telling the story, he looks at me and goes, "That's why we're here, Mooney. That's why we're here." He said, "Otherwise, they would have killed her." Granny Boo's imagination and daring here in walking backwards in the sand, concealing her movement to Queensland with Charlie, exemplifies the decisive moment that would shape herself, her family, in their history in the century to come, as in the retelling of this story from Rudy to Doug. And in this moment of competing agencies, we see at once the limits of kind of imposing boundaries onto the islands themselves. In From this point here, the idea of mapping the Pacific and the continuity of oral storytelling helpfully frames one of the more impressive framers of the Pacific short story in Louis Beck. Beck famously wrote of his experiences as a supercargo in German and British blackbirding vessels, including with the infamous trader William Bully Hayes, who could be considered the con man of Beck's oeuvre. While continually asked of Hayes, the pair only spent 8 months together aboard the Lenora in 1874, according to Grove Day. Beck, however, wrote at least 4 short stories that look back to Hayes and what he called the halcyon days of the blackbirding trade before regulation. Beck's retelling of this trade represents the thickening of language, as I kind of refer to it, oral, written, and translated, between the single atrocity and the wider trade, in the popularization of blackbirding narratives. And here I'm drawing on Manny Trigas's recent work on the Pacific Tale, in which he describes Beck's trader's voice as exhibiting a shared knowledge of all parts of the vast ocean, its islands, atolls, and reefs, as well as its peoples. It is, however, difficult to place Beck on fact and fiction. I'm drawing on Christopher Spicer here as well, who argues that Beck's voice is complicated by its layering, the projection of a distance between the story and the storyteller, the cacophony of voices speaking over one another, the fallibility of Beck's memory in writing back to events, and ultimately his interest in myth-making. Beck had a capacity to frame his reader through multiple overlapping vantages of the blackbirding archipelago, from around, above, eyes closed, or simply passing through. Consider his short story Collier the Blackbirder of Pacific Tales. The story is first introduced earlier in the collection. We hear through Prescott of Nauru of Collier as a queer trader in Tahiti, waiting for a passage to Samoa. The story then opens with a dizzying array of times and locations that ask the reader to perform a shipping route of their own, from Sydney to Papeete Harbour in Tahiti after Fakrava. These narrative layers allegorize the contested mooring points of repeated retellings, circling the queerness of Collier and his account. Beck links these retellings with the contested origins of the trade, which, as Collier suggests later in the story, began not with Boyd or in Vanuatu, again according to Collier through Beck, but in the Marquesas Islands of Polynesia. Quote, "God's curse rests on those who started in Polynesia," I say. These complications continue with the manner of the story's telling. The story is not told by the narrator, but overheard. Dennison, Beck avatar, is told by Collier of how he'd met Melanie, his Tahitian fiancée, and her father Marama while working as a supercargo on the Ethan Allen, a ship seeking blackbirded laborers for the owner's plantation in Tahiti. The ship intercepts the family, Melanie being a child at the time, aboard a disabled vessel in the Cook's Group on the precipice of starvation. The family and their crew agree to work the boat in exchange for transport to their destination by way of the blackbirding route. From this point, a further narrative layer develops. Collier retells Marama's experience of being sent ashore to help coerce islanders for recruitment. This sees Collier attempt to piece together Marama's own account, which Collier comes to authenticate through his own account of seeing the sight of blood smeared on a longboat. And he swears in a telling conditional tense, "I would never ship in such a bloody trade again." The story climaxes as Collier falls asleep, tellingly, on watch below deck, overseeing the laborers in the hold. A guilty refusal to observe that allows the islanders to seize the ship and take revenge. This act of unseeing, performatively, as we track the story forward, justifies Collier's murder of islanders, as we can kind of loosely piece together the story, in order for his to escape with Marama. this guilt is repeated as this same line is repeated in a future tense, as Collier swears again, "I'll never ship in another Blackbirder." This movement from conditional to future tense in a repeated line, in a repeated story of an event long past, albeit creates a layered linguistic structure that distances a reader or seeks to distance a reader from a trade that was ongoing at that time, albeit in different degrees of coercion. The story ultimately allegorizes the turning of a page on the trade, seeking ending in the end with a request for a reader's unseeing forgiveness, like Collier. After Marama and Collier escape, Marama's daughters pray to God to forgive Marama and Collier for the shedding of blood. The closing doubles Marama as father and Collier as husband as equally bloodied partners in the violence that typify the halcyon days of blackbirding, resulting in the creation of a perverse family structure. Collier's husband and son-in-law inaugurating a historical consciousness of a blind atonement for a single atrocity in a wider traffic of abuse and deception. Collier's swearing to never ship again would be contradicted by the popularization of blackbirding narratives in the time of deportation. Beck himself would continuously publish on the trade before and after the deportation of South Sea Islanders in the Pacific Islanders Bill of 1901, from The Recruiters, his story published in 1905, to On the Joys of Recruiting Blackbirds in 1907. These narratives represented the traders' transition into a white Australia. In this time, we see the legislated deportation of approximately 7,500 islanders, deportations that coincided with the arrival of an entire genre of Pacific tales told in Beck's wake, part of what David Carter describes as a sea of print in what would be later defined in another decade as the 1920s and 1930s modernity. In this wave, we also see the reinvention of blackbirding companies themselves. Victoria Kutainen, Susan Liebich, and Sarah Galately usefully point out that Burns Phillip and Company sponsor BP magazine to express a new, this is the image on the far right here, a new vision of cosmopolitanism and tourism, and to also renew the company's image from its colloquial, as it was colloquially known as being bloody pirates. Now, these trends extend this archipelagic dynamic. The periodicals and popular tales told after deportation produced islands and islanders as a presence to be removed for subsumption back into an extended imperialist and touristic imaginary. New Zealand-born author and activist Jean Devani returns to the moment of deportation in the fallout of the Pacific Theatre and the breakup of this myth of white Australian supremacy over the Pacific. Here, I would like to note that in focusing on Devani's novel Cindy and historical research expressed in materials held in JCU special collections, I'm very grateful and want to note that these photographs displayed on the slides here are copyright owned, and I'm very grateful to the Devani family for providing permission to use them today. These manuscripts see Devani overlay the post-war Pacific with the period of deportation. After Cindy was published, Devani requested a US publishing agent circulate her novel among US forces stationed in the Pacific, noting its public interest and that deportation was, quote, absolutely untouched except by me. And, quote, I am the recognized authority on the cane field in the writing world of Australia. The period of deportation, she wrote later, saw the transition to white Australian protectionist policies and consequently, quote, the changeover from semi-feudal estates to small-scale farming under individual ownership. Continuing our archipelagic metaphor, the decentralization and fragmentation of a blackbirding empire into private holdings. Devani had planned by this time to write a trilogy of sugarcane novels. The first, Cindy, alternatively titled Kanaka Symphony, as a title she came to much later, was set in Mossman around the last decade of the blackbirding trade. The second, the unpublished One Can't Have Everything, would depict the 20s, the period during which the Italian migrants could come into the trade, the growth of the grandchildren. This is quoting Devani's script. And the third, also unpublished, bringing the reader into the Second World War and a changing political scene. Devani gathered extensive records that would inform the trilogy. By 1949, she'd interviewed at least 5 interlocutors in the Mossman region: Reverend Father Taft, R.D. Rex, then chairman of the Mossman District Council, and through Taft, 2 South Sea Islander men by the name of Tabby and Sally Rome, the latter who had worked for J.D. Johnston, a good planter, whose mango estate was likely the inspiration for Cindy's Palmer estate. I want to note, though, that Devani was not uncritical. Her interviews are paraphrased and at times challenged, cancelling entire sections out, and at times she balances Taft and Rex against one another. For instance, in the bottom image, on the question of the arrival of machinery into the cane fields in 1994 is the kind of the point which is describing this. These papers reveal a fictive play with historical truth that had disappeared from view almost from Boyd's departure, thickening into the popularist tales of deportation under Collier's sleeping gaze. Devani adds her own fictive layers by commenting on this history, by way of signaling an authorial decision. Reading Devani's commentary on an 1897 balance sheet of sugar mill shareholders, we come across a fictive addition to the balance. Quote, as district grew, other news farmers like Biddo, so a reference to the Biddo planters in Cindy, her novel Cindy, wished to come into cooperative, but Cindy suggested not bothering, but subletting and growing coffee. Or, referring to the opinion of journalist E.J. Brady, Devani notes that the sugar industry, quote, industry must die without blackbirding. Before writing, quote, has Cindy reflect that not until about 1912 were last cans repatriated, Tawana. So basically indicating that Tawana, the character, would re-emerge after deportation in the following book, signaling his proximity to Cindy. And then in a kind of a pencil mark, we see Cindy reflects on often. Both statements then account for the continuity in memory and in agricultural output of the plantation economy, in despite of its death, as it was kind of regarded in the narratives of the time. Devani's historical anachronisms diffract a particular plantation in this wider Blackbirding archipelago that I'm attempting to sketch out. Cindy was set, and her interviews largely take place in Mossman, Cindy country, as she calls it in her autobiography, where, quoting Taft, quote, once they were here, in this area at least, islanders were not hardly done by. However, working from this example, Devani did project exceptions. She drew visceral racisms taken from across histories, and she includes a version of the 1883 Mackay racecourse riots as retold by Taft, so again, her interlocutor. But Taft places it within a competitive opposition of Aboriginal Australian and South Sea Islander racism. So, for instance, locating it not in the refusal of the sale of alcohol, as Clive Moore positions it as the kind of the dominant historical narrative, but in the calling of a South Sea Islander slang term that is often used to refer to an Aboriginal person. Cindy reckons with these fluctuations and anachronisms by basically working through, by projecting them back onto the plantation structure, expressing the formation of identity and class consciousness under contained and collapsed racial boundaries. So as the novel opens, Cindy visits the Callaghan plantation, and we are introduced to a series of tracked relationships between racialized communities. On the subject of an absent Aboriginal maid, Cindy is told, quote, a black girl, Alice, is at the camp on the creek having a baby. She got too friendly with a Kanaka, I think. And later, Mary Callaghan notes an unnamed worker is, quote, an Aborigine married to a Kanaka. Right, so these are loaded terms that basically track relationships between. Cindy discovers a more progressive set of power relations on the Biddo's Palmer Estate plantation, where islanders are known by their original names, shaking, for quote, her assumption of innate superiority to black-skinned folk. This dovetails with a more fluid interplay of identity. The plantation owner, Robert Biddo, goes so far as to compare himself to an indentured labourer, saying to his wife Blanche, I work like one, don't I? A claim that, as Elizabeth Smith notes, subtends a claim for, quote, work that was in fact done by slaves and or employed labourers, quote, end quote. However, the character Cindy circumscribes the terms of these connections. Just, for instance, she's described in town as having, quote, some secret magic of her own in the handling of Aboriginal Following the sports day violence, this allusion to the Mackay racecourse riots with news of an impending strike, Cindy attempts to corral the islander labourers against the conjured spectre of Aboriginality. quote, the male Aborigine is as good as you Kanakas any day. He's as intelligent as you, and he can work as well as you can. And speaking after Cindy, the eventual love interest that kind of ends the narrative, Ralph Bitto, the inheritor of the state, allegorizes these circumscribed divisions in the following way. You blokes have learned your contempt for the Australian black from us whites. You know that we have to look after you people in a sort of way. This idea of learned contempt critiques the imposition of relations in a settler colony, but basically authenticates itself through comparison and ventriloquism. As Carol Ferrier recently noted, Ralph's speech here is taken up in the end by the islander, projected onto the islander worker So, who comments, quote, the white man, he all the time on top. If Kanaka, he thinks he better than other black men. Cindy bifurcates then South Sea Islander and Aboriginal cane workers within a racist telos of competitive labour. And notably, Divani's focus on conflict frames these relations, concealing, while there are certain exceptions in the plantation, the extent of Islander Aboriginal intermarriage across the period. For instance, in an interview, one South Sea Islander descendant remembers a long history of intermarriage in Mackay and the Tweed, but notes we don't talk about that, and we don't talk as strongly about that as we should. These connections are historically supported by Peter Griggs, who points out that Aboriginal peoples from Cherbourg, Palm Island, and Yarrabah missions worked the sugarcane industries across Queensland after deportation and before migrant labourers. In this sense, Divani uses and adapts a historically specific example to extrapolate a template of plantation relations that bifurcate Indigenous and Islander realities. Among many other factors, this bifurcation likely played a part in Cindy's critical reception. Divani recalls the words of Len Fox, an editor of the Commonwealth Party Association, the Communist Party Association Journal. Quote, you represent, this is the words of Fox to Divani, you represent the Kanakas as living under a benevolent feudalism when actually they were slaves and brutally treated. This event, or this point of critical reception, among a series of remarkable abuses of power Divani encountered from male members of the party, well documented by Ferrier, reflects an imaginary frame by a singular idea of blackbirding, which is then framed by 19th century US slave narratives. For instance, as Divani writes in correspondence, Cindy was ultimately rejected because it featured historical truth, when what was wanted was a spurious Uncle Tom's Cabin. Cindy, in my view, however, should be remembered as a work of fiction that returns to the terms of history in fictionalizing the collapsed boundaries of both the plantation structure and the blackbirding history itself, drawing on, for instance, a specific history that is then projected out to make sense of this wider trade, mediating factual and fictive languages of recruitment. That had, the distinction of which had been obscured through years of popular retellings. As the waves of decolonization shake the Pacific in the 1970s, Australian South Sea Islanders such as Faith Bandler, Mabel Edmund, and Nolfa Nauna use literary and autobiographical forms to retell the history of their family's arrival in Australia. In this period, we see the emergence of what I'm calling kind of an archipelagic memory, following developments in kind of archipelagic studies and island studies in those fields. And by that, I mean that in this period, we see a moment in which writers such as Bandler recognizes the terms of the metonymic leap that they're performing. They're recognizing this relationship between the part and the whole, the way a single experience can be duplicated in other times and places, recognizing that historical relationship and using it for their own fictive and historical impact to kind of engage a public. These works, however, were framed by, at the time, the re-emergence of blackbirding history as fact from popular myth, so kind of a reversal, if you like, from the years of Beck. H.E. Maud writes in a foreword to William Warren's Sea Captain's account of blackbirding that it could be, quote, relied upon as evidence of fact rather than fiction, the main primary source on the Queensland labour trade. In this time, we also see the beginnings of interviews with South Sea Islander, such as, for instance, Noel Fatnauna, and work from Patricia Mercer and Clive Moore. And it's from this point that earlier writings and oral storytelling enter into blackbirding histories, but which then ultimately are fed back into Australian fictions at the time. So, for instance, Ferrier recognizes that Nancy Cato popularizes her Chindura plantation novel Brown Sugar from real persons highlighted in Warren's accounts, which had just been recently reproduced. Bandler, among others, wrote, I think, quite intentionally about the necessity of fictionalizing inherited gaps in official and family narratives. In her second novel, Wellower, she would write powerfully of inheriting the outlines of a blackbirding story as it was told through various intergenerational links. This passage comes from the perspective of her mother, Ida, as she kind of comes to an image of spread ash in the place of a fireplace, where the night before, Faith's father, Wakvi, had quote had sketched on the ground illustrations of the stories he had told the night before. Stories told of the white-winged ships that had gone to the shores of Ambram in search of men to work the Queensland sugar fields. On the mornings after those stories, Ivy would find islands in the ships in the cold grey ashes, and she would shiver. The ashy outlines of islands and ships have gone cold with time, no longer burnished with sensory metaphors from, quote, white-winged ships or the shores of Ambram to simply white-winged ships. Bandler is left with the task of tracing a picture from these ashy outlines, choosing in the end to balance her family's individual perspectives with collective experiences in the public record. She opens her first novel, Wakfi, with the statement, quote, and this is a statement I think is the defining sentence, I think, of this whole talk. Oh, this and another one to follow, quote, all other characters in this book are composites of real people, but the main events are true. This statement, I think, must be understood in the context of the bifurcation of fiction and history in Blackbirding accounts. As Corinne Bell-Devias points out in their PhD thesis, Wakfi, at the time and since, was arguably never read as literature. In an interview with Carolyn Craig in 1993, Bandler remembers that the first publisher to receive the manuscript asked her to have coffee with him, only to say, well, it's not really a book, isn't it? And, as Bandler would go on in the interview, it would be published within a few months. Following decades of work as an activist, Wakfi was read through the prism of race. At the time, in Adam Shoemaker's Black Skin, White Mark, White Page, Black Marks, is quite the most simple and reserved of Black Australian novels. And also in its public history, Clive Moore, for instance, comments that the novel is not typical and returns to it in his article on the Mackay racecourse riots. These focuses obscure, I think, in reading for veracity or evocation. Bandler's interest in balancing these two registers, adapting the imagery and accounts of the trade in order to meet the interests of her own experience. What she was going through, in a sense, what in reading Blackbirding accounts was quoting W.E.B. Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk, quote, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. Wakvi's composite of historical and family narratives inverts the gaze of the historical record to encourage a rereading, ultimately, of these materials and their intentions. Bandler therefore presents us with the potential for blackbirding to be repeated, this archipelagic conceit. She describes the event of Wakvi's blackbirding as, quote, the present invasion by those now in the cove that might be repeated many times over. They were faced with the danger of the island losing many of its men. This is an exemplary archipelagic motif again. It's a single event that can be repeated with a difference and therefore denied, making it impossible to be traced to a point of origin or to be solely defined by that origin. Bandler's mediated engagement with the historical record can, however, be traced. As with Devani, certain manuscripts and letters are publicly available in the Mitchell Library. Among these, we find donated records and photographs to a public exhibition Bandler organized titled Australia Blackbirding, Pacific Island Labour, A Personal View by Faith Bandler, such as, for instance, on the left, we have a list of islanders employed on an unstated brewery plantation, the Barrier State, including her father's cousin, which you'll loosely find at the bottom here. I forget to see, but I think it's around these lines. And following the era of deportation, the meeting of two generations of sugarcane laborers met alongside the Tweed Library. sorry, or alongside the Tweed River. I was looking at Mitchell Library on the slide here. Bandler also gave numerous interviews on the subject of her fiction, tracing Wackby to a pivotal visit to Vanuatu in 1974 with her husband Hans and her daughter Lillian, a snapshot of which opens the preface of Wackby. In an interview with Craig, Bandler describes a welcome party onto the beach of Ambrym, followed by a visit to Biak, the Ambrym village where her father had been born. The visit also led her to various gaps between stories that, she had to work to fill as a novelist and as kind of a public figure. Commenting on the role of research in creative writing, she states, quote, "I guess the lesson I learned was to be awfully careful about what you're told, particularly by your own relatives." With these gaps in the balance, Wackby tells the story of Peter Mussing, Wackby, Faith's father, blackbirded from the island of Ambrym as a 13-year-old in 1883, shackled in irons on board a ship in Tanna, and sold at the Leichhardt tree in Mackay, pictured here alongside Fiona Foley's sculpture Sugar Cubes. The tree, just to kind of note, it was used as an anchor for many of the ships coming into the harbour, so there's an immense symbolic significance for the trade. Wackby worked on a plantation in the area, possibly Homebush or fairly plantation, only to escape on a horse in 1897 to Tumbulgum in the Tweed region, where he married Faith's mother Ida before passing away in 1924. Bandler narrates this individual record with a collective experience using first and third person, tellingly. And as Ferrier astutely points out, eyes and voice are represented as having central importance by Bandler. Bandler, for instance, uses third person to describe the blackbirder auctioneer situated underneath the Leichhardt tree, who's overseeing a range of recruits. Quote, "Using a wooden hammer on an upturned timber box, he began to auction the new arrivals before Bandler utilizes a kind of an omniscient first person, before we're able to step inside his thoughts. Quote, in a kind of free and indirect discourse. Quote, he never thought of these men as people for fear of losing his perspective. But on these terms, the novel was read as a loss of perspective, while working to engage a wider loss of perspective, the inflexible view that allowed for the repetition of injustices and abuses within the trade, after regulation and in deportation." Bandler distorts historical sequences precisely to reopen the trade for public critique. For instance, there's the telling and forgetting of the digging of a mass grave for those killed in the Mackay racecourse riot in 1883, which I discussed earlier. Quote, "Wackby remembered going with the men and getting the bodies from the deep furrows. He recalled helping to dig that night the common grave into which they lowered the dead." This kind of remembrance comes after a conversation where he seemingly doesn't remember. So it's kind of this prompted, repressed memory that comes to the surface. In his reading of the scene, Clive Moore is cautious, and writing from a historian's perspective, is unable to verify the extent of deaths in the racecourse riots through oral testimonies, but also views the matter as not settled, given the available evidence. So we're entering into the context of fiction and narrative. Bandler's use of fiction to represent the event must be placed within a series of narrative layers then, the first of which could begin with Boyd in 1847, but also, for instance, could be the series of oral histories that surround this event. There is also, for instance, the burial of islanders to the so-called heathen cemetery of Mackay, the unknown whereabouts of other bodies supposed to be close to outside of Mackay Hospital, the historical ambiguity of the scope of injustices, and also Bandler's interest in connecting experiences together, which one could link further, for instance, to a multi-directional memory that may have an oblique connection to, among other things, the transatlantic slave trade and the Holocaust. Bandler was writing after a return from Europe. She visits Vanuatu in 1974 after a return from Europe with her husband Hans, who had survived the administrative murders of, Dachau and Buchenwald in the Nazi regime. Bandler's relationship to historical memory is most powerfully represented in a vivid portrayal of the cleaning of a blackbirding ship as it nears Flattop Island outside of Mackay. Quote, "The floors and walls were washed with brushes. When they dried, brushes were used again to make the walls very white. The blood marks were carefully removed and the vessel began to take on a new appearance." The act here encouraged us to question the extent to which a specific experience of removal could be repeated without our knowing, or from a literary perspective, whether we are reading an original expression or one that is fictively adorned from the public record. The latter is true. Bandler's description closely resembles a confession by Dr. James Patrick Murray, the part owner of the Carl in 1871. Murray testified that while off the coast of Buka Island, a group of islanders used poles to attach to attack the hatchway, allegedly setting fire to the ship. The crew fired their muskets indiscriminately into the hold, by two accounts under Murray's command, to the effect that they murder 70 islanders in a massacre. But as Mandy Trigus points out in the Pacific Tale, this was not a hot-blooded act of retribution, as the crew, quote, continued to do so intermittently for the next 8 hours, stopping for coffee and breakfast at 4 a.m. before resuming the slaughter. There's a close parallel, I think, in the description Murray uses to describe the whitewashing of these stains. And so successfully was this done, I'm just picking up the paragraph here, that although the vessel was about a fortnight afterwards boarded by an officer of HMS Rosario, nothing was discovered. In repeating the event, Bandler marks a turn in the historical memory of the trade to consider the continuity of Australian plantations with unregulated systems of forced labour. Fittingly, WACV's characters operate as an extension of this dynamic. They frequently reinvent themselves as they move inside and outside of the plantation house, where, for instance, Emco, a close friend of WACV, acts as a domestic servant, but is able to use this role to provide food to Islander children via way of the kitchen, who, quote, come to them with their mothers to collect the scraps. And notably, WACV often reflects on those who escape the narrative into an opacity that is synonymous with an escape from historical specificity. Quote, all of this bother with time was a nuisance, he thought, wondering if Mully would be free of the bother. Now he had gone away from the sugarcane. Perhaps time was only important where the cane grew. Murray's prophesied return at the end of the novel in chapter 18 establishes a link between those who remain and those who leave, creating the beginnings of a historical memory, where leaving a reader, in a sense, with this archipelagic landscape of memory that I've tried to draw out. Rather than, for instance, an ambiguity of historical record, we enter an ambiguity of emotional and lived experience. And on those terms, paraphrasing Ross Gibson's own account of blackbirding and 7 versions of an Australian Badlands, we may, quote, atomize hundreds of communities from that starburst of islands. I'm going to close here, but in closing, I'd like to speak to one return memory of the trade written in 2021 via the poetry and anthology Sister Stand Up Strong. In this anthology, Lusana Natterman's poem, The Bitterness of Sugarcane, is a verse story set in Tanna and an undefined Queensland town. Natterman introduces the narrator as a teenager, one of many taken from the islands at a young age, as were the relatives of so many that I interviewed. The speaker dreams of the islands, quote, sitting under the cool arms of a banyan tree, telling stories and laughing at Yapsi's jokes, before he's interrupted by a white overseer. I said, cut those canes properly. As the workers sit and recover from the day's work, the uncle sings a song that washes over the group, a song of memory that is translated between Ni Vanuatu to English. And I'm just going to quote 2 lines from that. Masuli in Makavan, an old man went from his house to his grandson's garden to steal vegetables and was carrying his home on his back. The song sends the speaker into memory of being sent to collect shells, coconuts, and fruits, only to see the white man in a giant wooden object floating out at sea. The boy is warned by his mother not to go, who waves her hand from the beach, only for 2 sailors to interject, coercing the speaker on board and into the ship's belly, often the point at which Australian narratives of blackbirding end, but where Natterman writes, I saw a man from our village tied up, both his legs and forehands were fastened by rope. The poem ends with a woman's face looking to the sea, left to address this gap, a marker of the Ni Vanuatuan telling of the story, the writer of the poem and the keeper of memory. She scans the curved distance of the horizon for a recognizable image, not just a ship, but that ship. That took her son, no, that stole her son. And in this expression, not focused on a ship, an abstraction, but that ship, and not took, but stole, represents a turn in the terms with which writers have remembered the trade, long obscured in bifurcations of fact and fiction that popularize or evade. Here, I'm going to kind of end on using a phrase from Manisha Anjali's wonderful poetry collection, Nag Mountain, in which Anjali writes, quote, we are marooned by the order of fictions and deceptions. Order of fiction and deception has become the order of the day, leaving it to us to connect a bifurcated historical memory. We look back to blackbirding at a time where archipelagos continue to be used and imagined in the containment and transportation of entire cultures, where people are trapped in contracts in modern slavery, where private interests work in extraterritorial black spots outside of legal sovereignty, where people are held and detained against their will with no recourse to justice. In this literary history, we see an example of working through these complications, where we may recognize the insular island as a figure of repeated differences, as a current invasion that may be repeated in other times and places. Thank you. I'll end there.
I like this effect that Zoom provides now, where applause explodes on the screen for us. It sort of gives us a bit of an idea of the reception to your talk, Dash. This is a moment where I invite questions, comments, discussion from the audience, and you can do so in a variety of ways. The chat is open there, and I'll keep an eye out on the chat there for Dash and pass on any questions that might come up on the chat. But if there are questions from the audience or comments, I noticed that Dash quoted a few people in his paper who are also here in the audience. So if there are any comments from those people, I'm not sure. Dash will be glad to receive them. So any questions or comments from the audience?
Roger, it's Mandy.
Yep. Yes, Mandy, go ahead.
Thanks, Dash. That was really, really great. Very broad view of the situation. Fabulous. My question was about Beck's drawing on the Brig Carl massacre. And do you have any thoughts about why he would displace it to Tahiti and have the labourers come from Kiribati and take them to Tahiti? And you mentioned, the tale sort of starts in Whakareva in the Taumotus. Why might he be doing that when it all played out in Fiji and it involved Australians and a court case in Sydney?
Great point. Yeah, I mean, there are simple answers in that, this is someone working with deniable differences. I mean, he's kind of trying to at once kind of conjure up like a popular history, but also benefit from the proximity of his tale to the events. I mean, presumably this would be something that he'd want to kind of draw upon, right, to kind of engage a readership. I have no clear answers to the kind of rationale, other than to say that there's, with Beck, I think, the fallibility of memory. It might be a question of his historical research, the kind of historical materials that he's engaging with. I was talking with Christopher Spicer here yesterday, and I think or the day before, about his role with editors, and maybe there's a kind of a displaced material there, but to displace just initial displacement there. But I think, as you've pointed out in the Pacific Tale, Mandy, I think with Beck, there's this kind of magic of weaving the Pacific that is performed often in the framing of stories, in which locations, I think we need to be quite skeptical, even suspicious of exact historical truths, even if these same tales are repeated. But yeah, I'd be curious for your view on this.
Well, in our imagination in Australia, we don't really know about the Trans-Pacific. We don't know that labourers were going across the Pacific from Kiribati to Hawaii and Tahiti and stuff. So that's kind of new information, I would say, to Australian readers. But yeah, I don't have a good answer either. I mean, yes, he's trying to paint this one Pacific that he knows, but you'd think it was far enough in the past for him to be able to refer a little more closely to the real historic events and places. I don't know. I don't have an idea.
All right, thanks, Mandy. I can see hands are up in the room now, and I'm not sure which one came up first, but I'll just go from left to right. Brenda.
Yeah, I think they're simultaneous. They just both popped up at the same time. So this is a much broader question, and I've actually posted it in the chat in case it's kind of rambling. Coming from my own interest in literature broadly. So you have literature, right? Let's say vaguely fictionalized story, in the way that you're talking about it. It's very specific, the kind that you're talking about, and claimed history, right? The official version. And I think in your paper, how literature is often more true than history, even in situations not quite as dramatic. And I'm wondering if you just want to expand on the value of literature in this way, both concretely, so sort of filling out the dominant white story, let's say in obvious ways, but more the value of literature and not only the story it tells, but how it tells it, and striking to contemporary issues, how those of us who tell the stories of these stories provide an important service.
Thank you, Brenda. It's great to hear from you again. Yeah, a big question. I think, I mean, on the kind of, I don't see literature as more true than history at all. I think from, from this talk at least, I really see a continuity, because it's the same, precisely, I think, because the relationship to, well, how should I term this? The relationship to facticity, the relationship to history is similar in oral histories, in popular accounts such as Beck, and in the reportage on the trade. So I think there's, like, I'm cautious of, like, the separation of those two. And but you're right, Brenda.
Yeah,
That,
not for us,
even
but
yeah,
for
yeah, yeah, no, no,
for the
just to make that
greater
point.
world, oh, that's story, that's
Yes.
fiction, that's history, and
Hmm.
you're absolutely right. And certainly in your case, and in a lot of earlier literature is right. There is no concept of literature until the 18th century. So
Yes. No, but, like, that's me making that proviso statement. In
uh,
answer to your question, I think, a kind of a literary reading, I guess, of these dynamics allows us to kind of understand how the repeated rhetorical forms that kind of return in justifications and critiques of the trade, the kind of etymology of terms that kind of are often kind of repeated, and but also change meaning over time. And I think in, like, the work of story, and I'm thinking about some of the ones I quoted. They again return us to the kind of the human scale. But to your point, also, literature with a capital L is not, immune from kind of the power relations that define the trade. It's precisely Beck and uh, or someone like W.B. Churchward, who provides the first kind of account of the trade, in 1888. That would then be, or Warren, who gets kind of picked up in the 1970s as the authentic idea that was then inform the fictions at the time. So yeah, there's no straightforward answer, but anyway, that was probably a rambling response, but yeah, thank you for the broad question. I'm still continuing to think through that
yeah,
relationship.
I mean, it gets complicated very quickly. Those defined categories that we like, or society in general likes, but then yeah, they break down very quickly and complexify. Thank you.
Thank you.
Across my screen, I see Paul, Isabel, and Victoria. So I'll go in that order. Paul Giles, welcome.
Yes, thanks, Dash. It was an interesting talk. I just wondered if you would like to, when you're sort of working through the project, put a little bit more pressure on this color, black and white. I noticed that you quoted from Bandler, the vessel's hold was cleansed and whitewashed.
Yeah.
And that obviously whitewashed is kind of deceptive thing. I mean, it's just covering something up. Blackbirding itself, the racial implications are obvious, but a lot of the work on slavery in America, particularly those that have those writers that have thought about the links with the Caribbean and with Latin America, Orlando Patterson and so on, Carl Diegler, have really sort of talked about the problematization of that binary opposition. I mean, Diegler wrote a famous book, Neither Black Nor White, talking about the links, with Jamaica and the Caribbean and so on. And Glissant himself
Mm.
wrote a book, Faulkner, the Faulkner, Mississippi book,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
again talks about métissage and, the ways in which the dynamics that Faulkner explores in Mississippi get complicated, in
Mm.
the Caribbean. So I just was wondering whether this kind of archipelagic dynamic, which you sort of described very interestingly, might be sort of widened in a kind of metaphorical sense. I mean,
Mm.
Brian Russell Roberts has done quite a lot of work, the Border Waters book
Yes.
and Archipelagic America, where he's sort of talked about the differences between archipelagic formations in the Caribbean, in the Pacific.
Mm.
He's very interested in Indonesia as well, of course.
Mm.
So,
Mm.
those kind of fluctuations might just introduce a slightly different dynamic into the complexities of the argument.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. I think that these dynamics are more emergent in, for instance, in Nag Mountain by Manisha Anjali, and I'll be referring to that in kind of a longer piece of writing. But to your point about the black-white dichotomy, I completely, yeah, this is, I guess, where the project is headed. And you're quite right to place critical pressure on those two terms. I think in the account Bandler's account of the whitewashing of the ship, this is, I mean, it's kind of a widespread historical practice where the literal whitewashing or like the painting over of a ship had enormous significance in allowing, for instance, the move out of particular jurisdictions. Like you could be painted over as a Queensland ship, and you had the little Queensland insignia, or you as a Fijian ship. So there's that literal painting over that is kind of is being referred to there. But I know your question is really about the kind of the um, bifurcation, let's say, of kind of white and black. That is kind of often a kind of a recurring theme, and I'll take that as a point to come back to. There's a few texts that kind of might bear that out a little bit more pressingly, and that work conceptually a little bit neater with Glissant and the kind of the archipelagic thought, and also with kind of the historical reality. These aren't the only people in plantations or the trade itself. There's obviously kind of migration from across Southeast Asia into, for instance, Mackay. But thanks, Paul. That's great.
Isabel, welcome.
Thank you so much for a really fascinating talk. I was thinking along similar lines, so also thinking about the archipelagic both as a physical mode, or physical symbol in the texts and both the historical imagery that you're looking at, but also as a symbolic mode. And I was just wondering if you can say a bit more about how different authors think about that as a way to connect, but also to overcome this idea of confinement and carcerality that is quite central to a lot of the experiences that you described.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is great. I guess there's a kind of a concerted turn to the archipelago as a kind of as a mode of kind of critiquing confinement, really with Bandler and Jali and kind of the 2020s and kind of narratives. At least that kind of I've picked up. But I think as I've kind of tried to like in symbolic terms, literally referring to the formation of inter-island memory collapsing, for instance, under kind of the histories of decolonization, like this a singular history, let's say. But the origins, I think, I think we need to kind of turn back to much earlier, like historicize that dynamic in the kind of the rhetorics of exceptionalism that build up around the trade, where in this even in the papers filed in regulating the trade by government agents, or the records of Captain Thomas Palmer, for instance. There's this certainty and ambiguity that kind of go hand in hand, and this is not oriented specifically to islands, but it takes place within the projection of carcerality onto the islands as a kind of a space of, I mean, in effect, the regulation of this period is delimiting abuses of power, but it's also producing the trade to continue in a certain context. So I think that's how I kind of think about it, and the rhetorical practice of those narratives kind of repeat those dynamics. Yeah, I mean, there's a few more kind of examples that I could probably provide, but maybe I might kind of pick that up with you afterwards, Isabel. Thank you so much for the question. It's a nice and helpful one to, rethink the key term here and its various like applications.
There's a comment in the or a few comments. Oh no, Brenda's written comment is there as well. Elizabeth Smythe gives me the opportunity to recognise my colleagues in the room. Elizabeth Smythe, Research Officer in the Roderick Centre, says, reminds us that literature and fiction in particular offers an emotional, affective experience of events that's often not available through historical documentation. So Elizabeth Smythe, Research Officer in the Roderick Centre. I'd like to welcome the director of the Roderick Centre for Australian Literature and Creative Writing, who had her hand up. Still up, Victoria? Yes, Victoria Katainen.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. I just get so nervous about making sure that I press the right button. But thank you, Dash. That was an incredibly wide-ranging talk that you managed to crystallize into this really brief period, but also which reflected, I think, a remarkable amount of depth in thinking about the operations of archipelagic thought, which I'm kind of new to, but have thought quite a lot about the idea of visibility and invisibility that you leveraged in your presentation, particularly around, the Pacific, but I've also thought about it around, topics of women that I've worked on in the 1920s and 30s, for example. But my question is still in formation. But what I think I want to say and ask is, you applied that thought and that frame, I think, really, really well to the objects of your analysis. And I'm wondering how much in your work you're going to apply that frame to the frame work of your analysis as well. Now, like, that sounds like a really meta question, and I hope it isn't. So let me just actually explain what I'm trying to say, which is, I think the frame of the nation, right? The frame of Australian literature in and of itself is partly what makes things visible and invisible at different times. And when you have, objects like women or racialized objects, that invisibility and visibility fluctuates in and out quite intensively, right? When you apply the frame of the nation over top of it. And that frame of the nation itself is a form of containment, or as you put it so well, like it's everywhere as well. It's the opposite. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that idea of applying that archipelagic thought to frameworks of analysis, number one. And number two, the frame of your own articulation of these ideas, if you've thought about how that also operates in that same way of, invisibility, visibility, containment, everywhereness. Because a talk like this obviously has to be contained in Zoom. But I know that when you're speaking in North Queensland in particular, there's a lot of people who will lack, a particular disciplinary framing to for a talk like this to land, and that's okay. They're not the audience of this. But how would the scholarship that you're working on right now also think about shifting frame in its impact so that it's not contained just within that scholarly discourse? Did anything I say just make sense to you?
No, that's great. And it's a helpful, concrete, grounding comment, I think. Let me just say on the kind of the point of archipelagic thought, I think just to say from the outset that I think mine is not like a conventional, straightforward, straight down the line kind of interpretation of it. I think Glissant's idea of a kind of as a challenge to continental and systemic thought is something that I've kind of grappled with for a long time. And through my PhD dissertation and in a few other places. really, I think this project returns to the kind of the problem Glissant and others were talking about, and this kind of the production of invisibility, or invisibility, as you say, Victoria, the kind of like the concealment and the perpetuation of different kind of uh, discourses, because it seemed to me that, at least in, critiques of, systemic or rooted thinking, that I think we need to be quite attentive to the reproduction of power through the archipelago, or through a thinking that kind of is mapped through that structure. The creation of extraterritorial spaces, the creation of exceptions, the placement of someone into a position of paranoia, for instance, or kind of in charting together impossible connections. So I guess that's the kind of where I kind of sit in relation to that wider body of ideas. It kind of comes through. I wanted to kind of shout out kind of Charles Rowley's Matter of Justice in this talk. It's kind of it's an interesting crossover, I think, to Solzhenitsyn's kind of work in the time at which the Pacific, I mean, he's like the president of this the Pacific administration for 10 years prior to his writing that. And he's also kind of writing this big critique of the Aboriginal reserve management system. So it's like this one idea that is used to map these different kind of networks of power in Australia and beyond. But Faith Bandler and other people are kind of are reading that. But that's not answering your question, which is, taking how to think about that same framework and being kind of, I guess, answerable to it, or kind of contesting like the singular geographies, or like the contained archives or kind of bodies of text that I'll be working with. This is always a kind of a useful point, I guess. In a longer version of this that'll eventually be published, I'll be kind of engaging with Fijian narratives. I've kind of worked on Satendra Nandan's work, for instance, among others. Manisha Anjali I've already referred to a few times today. I was just at kind of just recently, I was at the University of Hawaii with Brenda, actually, and where I was able to kind of do a bit of thinking about indenture precisely in that Hawaii kind of context. So I guess that those are areas in which I'm researching, but because of the concept, my position grounded in Townsville, in Cairns, coming by way of Mackay, I wanted to present that kind of a grounded perspective, and by way of Sydney too. I'm conscious here, Imelda in the room, who I'd love to kind of hear a question from if you have one. Do you want to jump in?
Oh, look, it's incredible what you've done, and I just want to thank everyone for having me pop up like this, random. But I really appreciated the work that you've done, Dashiell, and especially seeing how you've transitioned from when we first met to now. It was just mind-blowing. So congratulations. I'm really, really happy about that. And how sensitive you've been around communicating with our communities, yeah? And your attentiveness, and just making sure that you respect the cultural protocols. But for me, getting my head around this as well, I'm not a deep-seated scholar or anything like that, but I'm a lived experience person that I think when you talk about this archipelago, I'd be interested in you going back to Vanuatu, like we've discussed, and getting the perspectives of the people, because for me, it speaks to cultural framework. When you use that terminology, and it'd be interesting to see what maybe the Tanese or Santo mob think about that terminology that you're using, and it might make more sense, because I think there's more at work here in terms of ancestral spirituality and all that kind of stuff that guides us with some of the work that we do. Sounds a bit airy-fairy, but it's a fact for us in terms of culture and custom. So something's, inspiring you to do this, and I just say keep following that, and get to Vanuatu to get that true, I guess, incentive around what happened, yeah? Because those islands or archipelagos are the living history, and the people that sit in our communities are our historians. And all this other peripheral work, which is fantastic, and it's bringing it to the fore in terms of academia. You know how I feel about all this stuff. So it's like, Yeah, I think more conversation with the people and just drawing on some of that stuff that, Auntie Faith and Uncle Doug Mooney. It was so nice to see him up there as well. And I really appreciate you following that through. So thank you.
No, thank you. I mean, I've been benefited so much from conversations with you, Imelda, on this. And I just want to say, like, it's easy to think archipelagically and to lose the kind of the center that holds that true. I mean, it might be a kind of a truism, but the very premise that I'm arguing against is this kind of like an idea of like this disconnected history where, stories are told in one place and exceptions kind of generate around that, or a particular kind of language or culture kind of takes a kind of a dominant hold, right? Thanks, Stephen. It's great to see you. Yeah, and it's ultimately to your point, Imelda, it's community, right? It's that kind of, it's making space and time for kind of engaging with people in dialogue that what the archipelago is, it's meant to do, rather than its kind of intellectualization as a concept.
And the thing is, it hasn't been done before. So this is all emerging. I mean, it's been done. I hope I'm not offending anyone, but it's been done, but it's just like, it's kind of like our time. And it's really great to take up these opportunities. So, and in terms of, that blackbirding history, slavery, whatever people or however people want to perceive it, only the people know what it was, what it felt like, at that time. So I think, just empowering those voices. And, there were 1.5 million as a part of a circular economy building for the Asia Pacific region. So there's so many stories out there to draw on historically.
Yeah, that's right. One of the things I've found in coming into this project, which is like one stage of this wider project, but just the sheer abundance of like material. There's, I mean, the people to talk to, there's the community, there's the history, the kind of the documentation of the, and then you come to like the production, and I'm really thinking of Bandy here, like of the Pacific Tale. There's just endless tales to kind of trace through, or autobiographies that you kind of people kind of provide you with, and you're just working through this endless these structures of narrative that just repeat and repeat. And it's why I think like that account from Doug, I mean, the kind of is so important, because it's at the point of being from the beach to be kind of to disappearing on her own terms. I think it's a really useful image to and live reality. That's easy for me to say as an image, as an academic researcher.
Thanks, Dash and Imelda, for the kind of wrapping up in that conversation you two had from a wonderful talk. I had a question, and it was sort of, maybe this is a comment to wrap up, and thank everyone for their contributions this afternoon. It was really interesting, Imelda, for you to say get to Vanuatu, Dash, and it was really, I was really thinking of the geographies that you started out with, and the multiple perspectives and the journeys that you've been on, Dash, and are about to go on as well, to be able to look at the Pacific from or consider the Pacific from Sydney, from Townsville, from Cairns, from Vanuatu, from Hawaii. That there are all of these different perspectives that you're going to be looking at, and drawing on those multiple perspectives from communities in all of those places, the multiple stories. It really demonstrates and emphasizes the importance of story for all of us in thinking through the present and the past and the future. It's been real pleasure to listen to your talk this afternoon, Dash. You've got a lot of work to do in the time ahead of you, and I wish you well in it. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and for your contributions to the discussion. Safe travels home, or if you're home already, have a nice evening, and we look forward to welcome you to the next seminar, which will be coming up in a few weeks' time. Thanks, everybody.